Well, amen. If you have your Bibles, you're going to be turning to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6, as we continue our journey through the book of Daniel, we're talking about the miraculous as well as the mysterious. And last week in Daniel chapter 6, we saw where Daniel was now under the rulership and under the servitude of King Darius, who was a Medo-Persian king. And just like always, he always rises at the top. When Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps, he appointed 3 commissioners over those, and Daniel was one of those commissioners. Not only that, as he got to know Daniel and he saw the extraordinary spirit that was in him and the wisdom that he had and the loyalty that he had, his intention was to appoint him to be over all the kingdom, to be the leader over all the kingdom. Well, some of those other leaders weren't really excited about that. They knew that Daniel had been in exile. He had come over from Jerusalem, and they weren't excited about him being in charge. So they set out to try to find some way to entrap him. Now, they couldn't find any way to entrap him regarding his business practices, because it said that he was innocent of all things. He was beyond reproach. He was just a man of exemplary character, and he was what everybody was looking for. So they couldn't find any way to accuse him. They said the only way we might be able to entrap him is that we can entrap him in relationship to his walk with his God. Because he's faithful in his service to his God, maybe we can entrap him some way. And so they obviously observed him and watched him, and we find out that Daniel had a devotional life that was such that he prayed 3 times a day. He went into his room, opened up the doors or the windows to Jerusalem, because that's what God had commanded them to do, to pray towards Jerusalem when they were in captivity, so that God might be able to restore them. He did that, obviously, 3 times a day. So they get together and they come and they tell the king, "King, what we have a plan is for one month, 30 days, you ought to put forth an edict that no one is to make petitions or prayers to any other man or God for those 30 days, but only to you." Well, Darius was not wise in that decision. His pride was in its place. He said, that sounds like a good idea, especially because they lied and said all the leaders had said that. Well, Daniel hadn't been one of those. He certainly wouldn't have agreed to that. So Darius signs in that edict. Remember how he signs it. He signs it according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which means this: it cannot be changed, because they viewed that the king was a god, and a god never makes mistakes. So if he wrote in a decree, that means the decree could not be changed, because that would mean that God made a mistake or changed his mind. So they had him to write it according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, so it could not be changed. As soon as Daniel heard about that edict, Daniel went to his house just like he always did. And you remember his example of a prayer life? Well, he was committed to pray 3 times a day. He not only was committed to pray, it says he went there and he prayed according to the promise of God, opened up that window, and he met with God and he prayed those promises before God. He was just committed in what he did, and he was faithful in what he did, and he had always done that. And just because there was an edict that said he couldn't, didn't mean it stopped him, so he went and prayed. Certainly those other leaders, once they found that he had done that, they came and told Darius, "Darius, do you remember that edict that you made, that no one was to make petition of any other gods or men for 30 days? And he said, "Yes, I do. It's according to the law of Medes and Persians." Well, there's one. That exile that's come over here, the one that you have in rulership, Daniel doesn't pay attention to you, and he doesn't abide by your edict, and he's been praying to his God. When Darius heard that, his heart was sorrowful, and he regretted what he had done. He knew he had made a mistake and had been a trap that had been set. But there was nothing he could do, even though he worked and said all the way till evening to try to find a way to get Daniel free. He could not do it. And they come and said, "Remember, it's the law of the Medes and Persians, and it cannot be changed, and therefore the king has to throw him into the lion's den," because that was the punishment. Anyone who would pray to any other god or man in those 30 days other than Darius would have to be thrown into the lion's den. We pick up with the story there in verse 16 of Daniel 6. "Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel," you ought to underline this, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." What a statement. That's made by King Darius. Verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles. Underline this, so that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel. That's going to be an important statement. So that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his place and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose with the dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near the den, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him. Underline this, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children and their wives, into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the people, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is, listen to these statements, he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. What a great story. Problem is we've sometimes given that to children. In the children's literature, we read about Daniel and the lion's den, but it's not a children's story. It's a story for everybody. Every one of us should study it, meditate on it, and know it, for it teaches some great and awesome truths. First of all, we know that he's a faithful man, dedicated to his God, even though it's going to cost him to be thrown in to the lion's den. We saw that last week. Then we find here that the king, because he cannot get out of the decree that he wrote, he has to throw him, Daniel, into that lion's den. But listen to the statement of faith that this king has in relation to God and his servant Daniel. There in verse 16, I had you underline it. The king, when they're taking Daniel to throw him into a lion's den. Now, in case you're wondering, that's a place where lions are dwelling, okay? I don't know why they have them. I don't know why they've got them there, but they're there. And they're real lions, not cats. They're real lions, all right? And it's a fearful experience. Would you imagine what it'd be like to be thrown into a den of lions? And that's going to be the punishment. So they're going to take him and they're going to throw him in. This is the king's statement. Listen to it. Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. Now that statement says a number of things. First of all, it says about his thoughts and his contemplations of the ability of Daniel's God. He said, your God is able and will deliver you. Your God that you serve is going to be able and deliver you out of the mouths of the lions, out of the lion's den, out of that tremendous danger. Your God who's actively involved, your God who is all powerful, your God that you serve, your God has the ability to save you. What a statement that he makes about God Jehovah, Yahweh. What a statement that he's making about this God that he doesn't serve, he doesn't know, he hasn't walked with, but he knows that this God, the God of Daniel, has all kinds of power, and he states that in his faith. He also states a faith in Daniel. This is what it says: your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. He knew about Daniel's life. Now, I don't know how he knew it. I guess he just watched him. He saw him. He saw the life that he lived. He saw the priority that he had. He knew he had a relationship with this God. And he says this about Daniel: Daniel, you're a man who constantly serves your God. There's no doubt about it. You constantly serve your God, and the God you serve is able and has the ability to deliver you. I don't know about you. I'd like for somebody to be able to say that about me. I'd like that to be the commentary or something that somebody would write about me in my life. Wouldn't you? Would you like to live in such a way that somebody would say, you are one who constantly serves your God? You're one who walks with your Lord in such a way that the Lord is going to do something special for you. That king stated something, a great statement of faith about God Jehovah, and he states it about Daniel and his relationship with that God. And here's a neat thing about faith. You need to write this down. He not only knows it and thinks it, he speaks it. Faith is to be spoken. You need to write that down. Faith is to be spoken. If you believe something, you should say it. If you believe something, you should speak it forth. It says that in the book of Romans, doesn't it? That which we believe in our heart, what is the rest of that? We confess with our mouths. I think y'all better look that up. That's Romans 10 when you get home, okay? You didn't do very good on that. Let's try that again, all right? That which we believe in our hearts, we confess with our mouths. We confess that with our mouths. And here's this king. He's not just in his heart over here saying, well, I tell you what, I think Daniel, he's got a really good walk with his God, and I think God's, all powerful. I think God might do something. He doesn't do that. He speaks it. He says it. Speaks that faith. Speaks about those promises. Speaks about what he believes. He speaks it. That's important that you speak it. If we believe something, we need to speak something. Now, this is worth you coming if you're a person who likes to walk by faith and are trying to learn how to walk by faith. This is something very important. If you believe it in your heart, you speak it with your mouth. Sometimes we lose the power of faith because we're afraid to speak it. Now, why are we afraid to speak it? What if God doesn't do it? What if God doesn't show up? What if God doesn't answer it? It's going to make me look bad. It's going to make God look bad. Don't worry about God. He's okay. He can handle himself. Don't worry about him, okay? And here's the truth of the matter. If you really believe it, you speak it with your mouth. And sometimes we lose the power of our faith because we're afraid to speak it. But if you really believe it in your heart, you confess it with your mouth. So the next time you're believing the Lord for something, remember, faith is saying it's so before it's so in order for it to be so. Did you get that, or is that too fast for you? Faith is saying it's so before it's so in order that it would be so. You understand that? It's speaking forth that truth, speaking forth that reality. You don't have to have faith if it's already happened. You don't have to have faith if it's already there. You have faith in order for it to be so. And the king speaks forth that faith. Now, let me show you an interesting thing about this old pagan king. He reveals to us the struggle of faith. Have you tried to believe God for something? Have you been trusting in God for something to do the impossible? Have you been trusting that God would show up and answer something, bring about something? Well, if you've ever done that, then you know that there is the struggle of faith, right? I believe it. I'm holding on to that. Does that make it smooth? No, it doesn't. Look at his struggle with faith. We'll skip down and look what happens to him in verse 18. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting. Not only was he fasting, and he had no entertainment. was brought before him. Now, I want you to notice one thing. This clarifies something. I've heard lately that we got new definitions for fasting around here. You know, we all got these definitions. I've heard people, I'm fasting from TV. Heard that. I'm fasting from buying new clothes. I'm fasting from eating chocolate. That's not fasting. Fasting always in the Bible is related to food. It means you don't eat, okay? Now, we can substitute all kinds of things. I want you to notice there to say he was fasting from his entertainment. Did it say that? It says he was fasting and then no entertainment was brought to him, okay? So when he's fasting, he's not eating anything and then he doesn't have any entertainment as well. I thought I'd clarify that for you in case you're really getting spiritual and fasting from your entertainment, okay? That's a real sacrifice to turn the TV off 1 hour or one night. That's not fasting is whenever it's no food, all right? And even no food and no drink in certain situations. But here's what the king does. He's fasting, he has no entertainment, and here's the other thing. He has a sleepless night. You know what he's doing? He's struggling. He has stated that God is able to deliver Daniel and that Daniel's going to be fine in the lion's den and God's going to preserve it. He stated that, but now he's going home and he's struggling with that. He's struggling with the point he fasts, doesn't have entertainment, he's up all night. I mean, he's got a sleepless night in regard to this because he's concerned, because he's anxious. He stated something, but he still has that struggle. Is he the only person in human history who ever struggled after they made a statement of faith? Or have you ever been there? You ever made that statement and then between the time, whenever you make the statement and what you believe and the time that it comes to pass, there's sometimes a struggle in there, right? Oh, yes, there is. But he still has faith, because look what happens next. In verse 19, then the king arose with the dawn at the break of day. As soon as daylight came, that's the first time he could go. As soon as daylight came, he goes and he went in haste. You know what that means? He ran. He was running as fast as he could. He was 62 when he took office, remember? So I don't know, I wouldn't be running very fast. But he gets there as fast as he can to that lion's den. He went right up to the lion's den. Look, notice what happened in verse 20. And when he had come near the den, to Daniel he cried out with a troubled voice. But he's crying out. Now, wait a minute. Don't criticize him. If he thought Daniel was dead, would he have gone to the lion's den? If he thought Daniel was dead, do you think he'd have gone there early? If he thought Daniel was really dead, do you think he'd have cried out to hear nothing? No. His very action says that even though he struggled all night long, he's still believing. He's still holding on. He cries out to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lion's den? And what does Daniel say? O king, live forever. Don't you know that king was glad to hear those words? Don't you know that he was glad? He comes and he speaks forth because he's been believing all night. Even though he struggled, he's coming expecting to hear from Daniel because he believes that Daniel's a faithful servant of a God who is able to intervene in that life and protect him even from vicious lions. And he might have struggled, but he comes there expecting and believing. Let me tell you something. That old pagan king right there in just those few verses give you a tremendous example and a tremendous encouragement about your journey of faith. And remember, all of us are supposed to be on that journey of faith. All of us are supposed to be believing God for the impossible. We're claiming the promises of God based on His very character and statement, and we're holding on. And yes, sometimes it's a struggle, and sometimes you have to go through that and just keep on believing. And sometimes you may have a sleepless night, but you keep asking and believing, and then you come, and what a blessing it is whenever your faith has brought about a great miracle, and God has truly intervened. Even an old pagan king can give you an example of what it's like to live by faith, to walk by faith. And I know he was rejoicing because of what he says in a few minutes. Well, that's the example of faith. But what happens to him in verse 17? Some tremendous things in this passage. Look at verse 17. What happens? When they take Daniel and they throw him in a lion's den. Look what happens in verse 17. And a stone was brought. That's important. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den. And look what happens next. And the king, that's Darius, sealed it with his own signet ring. You know how that happened? They put wax on it. He'd take his signet ring and he'd put that on the wax. And that was never to be broken. If that wax where the signet ring was broken, somebody had tampered with it. Somebody had troubled with it. So the king puts his signet ring on that. Notice what happens next. And the signet rings of his nobles. Somebody wasn't trusting somebody, were they? The king's signet ring should have been enough. But no, the nobles wanted their signet rings on there too. For what? Here's the important thing I had you underline. Listen. So that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel. What a statement. They put a stone over the lion's den. They put a seal with a signet ring on it to ensure that nothing in regard to Daniel would be changed. That's funny, isn't it? Because everything with Daniel is changed. But here's the key. All the change that happens with Daniel happens under the stone and behind the seal. Did you hear me? Y'all look kind of tired this morning. We need to get up and do calisthenics. Y'all look like you're about to sleep already. Now this is exciting. You need to think about this, okay? They put a seal on a stone to make sure nothing changed about Daniel. And God, He doesn't pay very much attention to seals and stones. Did you know that? God just goes right in behind, under that stone, and right in through that seal. And God gets in there and He changes everything. He changes everything. Instead of a lion eating Daniel, Daniel is preserved. The angel of God shows up. The lions cannot attack him anyway. He's as safe and as in his mother's arms. All that changes in relationship to Daniel behind the stone and behind the seal. But they were making sure nothing changed. Now think just a minute for all of you who study the Bible. Think for just a minute. Does that bring to your remembrance anything? You ever heard anything about a stone and a seal before? Where was, help me, where was that? Christ? Where was it with Christ? With what? The tomb. Oh man, there we go. The resurrection of Jesus. Read it in Matthew 27. It's about verses 60 through 66. Matthew records it this way, that they put a stone before in the entrance of the temple, a large stone. But some of the Jews came and said, hey, we've heard about that. He said he was going to resurrect in 3 days. We know what they're going to do. They're going to come steal his body. And then it's going to be worse than before. So what we need for you to do is to put a seal on the stone, a seal on the tomb, so that nobody will bother and nothing will be changed in relationship to Jesus. Well, God didn't pay a bit more attention to that stone or that seal than He did in Daniel's time, because you know what? All the change came behind the stone and behind the seal. Because just as God protected Daniel from the lions, God breathed life into His Son. And I'm just glad to know that a stone and a seal doesn't keep God from doing what God chooses to do and works the way God chooses to work. Well, that's not all. What happens? Whenever the king comes and he says to him, hey, are you there, Daniel? Did your God save you? Did He watch over you? Listen to the testimony. Listen to the testimony of this man. First of all, in verse 21, he says this, "Then the king spoke to the king, 'O king, live forever.'" Now, that may not mean something to you. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to me in my life experience. Think about it for just a minute. If somebody had thrown you in the lion's den, what would you want to say to them? Now think about that for just a minute. If somebody had thrown you, okay, wait a minute. You had been one of his commissioners. You had been so good to him that he was going to put you in charge of everything else. He believed a lie about a decree, made a decree that was totally contrary to you, and then he can't find a way out, doesn't Medes and Persians, and he finally throws you into a lion's den. Even though somebody deceived him, he did that. He's thrown you in a lion's den, covered it up with a stone, sealed it, and he's left you there all night long with those lions. And whenever he cries out, "Daniel, did you live? O king, live forever." That's not what I thought he might say. What's your thought? You think you'd have been angry? Think you'd have been bitter? Now, wait a minute. Before you start looking so holy, you better think about it just a minute. Whenever you get done wrong, maybe you haven't been thrown in the lion's den, but you've been chewed on. Right? How do you feel? How do you respond to that? How would he say, "O king, live forever"? Here's how. Same way you can say it. Listen, Daniel was not concerned about lions. Daniel was only concerned about living for his God. And Daniel knew that this occasion was another occasion for Jehovah God to reveal himself. And if it's another occasion for Jehovah God to reveal himself, even if a king's not very smart in what he does, he can say, "O king, live forever." No bitterness in his heart. He's just rejoicing that God's shown up, that God gets glory for what God is doing. You need to realize the same thing. Whenever that occasion comes for you to be bitter and angry and frustrated and aggravated and hold a grudge, you better make sure that you see that God's still in charge. God's just as much in charge of your life as he was Daniel's. And maybe the situation you're going through and what's happening in your life might be because God wants an occasion to get some glory. Some glory through your circumstances, through your situation. It may not mean a lot to you, it means a whole lot to me that he would say that. What else does he say? He gives his testimony. Listen to the testimony. Here's his testimony. "O king, live forever." Verse 22, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me." Did you hear that? An angel of God has shown up in the lion's den. It's not just Daniel and the lions, it's Daniel, lions, and an angel of God. That always makes a difference. Remember, behind the stone, behind the seal, right? The lion has shown up and has shut their mouths. The angel showed up and shut the lion's mouth. Wait a minute, that's not the whole story, is it? No, that's not the whole story. Did the angel just shut their mouths? No. What do you think those lions, do you think those lions had any claws? You think they had claws or had they declawed them? No, they had claws. Even if their mouths were shut, you think their claws could do it? They could have cut him to shreds. Not just it wasn't just their mouths that were shut. They'd been tamed because, wait a minute, they could have played with him like a toy. Have you ever seen a cat play with a ball? Do you know what a lion is? I'm going to help you this morning. You're going to be a lot smarter when you leave it. You know what a lion is? A big cat. A big cat. If they weren't even hungry, they could have played with him like a ball. Just because there was something new to entertain them. Do you think he might have been hurt? Absolutely. See, the angel of God did not just come and shut their mouths. He tamed them. He prevented them from doing any harm to him, which I think is exciting. Let me tell you something it reminded me of about that. One of the things that God wants us to understand about that is God's still in charge of animals. Do you know that? You just need to do a study of that sometime. Get your concordance out. Do a study of that. I'll remind you of a few things. Here's how he's in charge of animals. You remember when Noah built the ark? The animals came and got on the ark 2 by 2. That's right. I'm giving y'all a chance to preach this morning. Y'all not helping a whole lot. 2 by 2. Do you think that Noah went out and gathered all those up? You think he went out there and got all these wild animals, he's going to go gather all of them up? Or do you think God marched them in there? God marched them in there. It had taken him another 100 years to catch all them animals, and they'd have been dead before he got the others. Have you ever tried to catch a cow? Just one cow. Did you ever try to catch them? Go catch them all. God's in charge of the animals. Do you remember whenever the children of Israel were hungry and they were complaining they didn't have any meat? You remember what God did? God told the quails to come, and the quails all came and landed in the camp. They didn't have to catch the quail. All the quail came and just landed in the camp. You remember when Balaam was making some really poor decisions and he wouldn't listen, he wouldn't pay attention to the angel God, he couldn't see it, and God used a donkey to what? To talk, to speak, in order to tell that prophet, right? Exactly. What about the cows that were lowing? You remember the cows that were lowing whenever the ark was with the Philistines? And they had the cows and they had calves, and they locked the calves up in the stalls, and the cows should have naturally gone there, and God directed those cows to bring that ark back to the people of God, even though their calves were still lowing. You remember when God had the raven to come to feed Elijah twice a day at the brook Cherith? Do you remember when those who made fun of Elisha, the prophet Elisha, remember what happened? God sent a she-bear, you remember that? To devour up and to beat up on those boys, those young boys. Be careful, young men. You remember a prophet, a guy named, what was his name? Jonah. What was his name? And they threw him overboard, and God prepared a fish to swallow him up for 3 days, and then commanded the fish to spit him out. That's right. Do you think it's a problem for God to handle animals? No. He's totally in charge because he created them. There's another truth about that you need to realize, though. And it's this, you realize this, that what Daniel experienced there in that den that night was like the futuristic events that are going to happen in our world. You know what it says is going to happen whenever God restores and Jesus brings the consummation time and redeems the world? You know what's going to happen to animals? The lion is going to lay down with the lamb. Whenever Jesus comes and reestablishes this world, there's going to be peace. Peace between animals and peace between animals and men. And the lions are going to graze like cattle. And there's going to be peace. And that night, right there with the angel of God, there was peace between that man of God and those lions. Here's another little footnote if you want to write it down. Here's another little footnote. The king of the jungle was no match for the King of Kings. Here's another little footnote in case you need another one, all right? That the Lion of the tribe of Judah masters all other lions. Because when it says the angel of the Lord, many times that's a theophany of Jesus showing up. And he was who? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. And here's one of the great, I see things funny. I was in my office just kind of laughing about this. I know y'all weren't there, but it was fun for me to laugh. I was having a good time. Did you know Daniel had a better night's sleep than the king did? You think about that? He was there in that lion's den with a bunch of lions around him, and he probably slept all night like a little baby. And the king's over there struggling all night long. The testimony, what did he say? Verse 22, his angels shut the lions' mouths, and they have done no harm to me. Then he tells you what is a goal, two goals for life. Here's what the goal is, verse 22. Inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king, I've committed no crime. Here's two goals in life. Be innocent before God and be innocent before men. If you can live your life innocent before God and innocent before men, you're doing all right. Because what does he say next? Verse 23, then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel, here's the commentary. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him. Why? Because he had trusted in his God. You want to be safe and secure? You trust in your God. That's the safest place in all the world to be, is trusting in your God. Look what happens next, very quickly. The reaction of the king. The king then gave orders and brought the men and their families who had lied and accused Daniel, brought the men, their wives, and their children, and had them thrown into the lion's den. He was very upset. Now, the law didn't require that. But Darius had been lied to, been deceived, been tricked. It wasn't just Daniel. And he threw all of those families in there. And notice a little commentary at the end of verse 24. And the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. In other words, the reason Daniel wasn't eaten is not because the lions weren't hungry. It's because he was protected. Whenever the others were thrown in, they were immediately devoured. And then what does he do? Here's what the king does. He makes a decree, verse 26. He made a decree in all the dominion of the kingdom. And first of all, he says this, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. That's number one. That's the decree. Men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, because he's a God like no other God. And then he writes about this God. He writes about this God. Here's this pagan king who knows some things about God. Here's what it is. Look, for he is the living God. I don't know about you, that's important to me. I'm glad I serve a living God who's actively involved in my life. He's aware of what's going on, and he can send the angel when I'm in the lion's den. Amen? He's a living God. Not only that, he is enduring forever. He never gets used up. He never gets old. He's always the same. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. When you're with him in his kingdom, you'll never have to worry about his kingdom being destroyed. Verse 27, he delivers and rescues. He performs signs and wonders. Where? In heaven and on earth. And then he makes it personal. Who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And when Daniel would have heard that decree, Daniel knew that the purpose behind it all was fulfilled. If you read this story and you come out of it thinking, boy, what a great man Daniel was, and he was. But that's not the purpose. Daniel knew the purpose was the whole experience is to not talk about how great Daniel is, it's to talk about how great his God is. If Darius had made a decree and talking about how great Daniel was, Daniel would have probably said, I think we need to rewrite that. Because it's not anything about Daniel, it's all about God. And here's the great thing that I know personally, and I know for us, we worship the same God. And he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And when he was living and active in Daniel's day, he's living and active in our day. And he preserves and watches over those who trust him just as they did in Daniel's day. And bless God, he's in charge of animal life. He's in charge of this world. He's in charge of all things. And we can be no safer than when we trust in him and watch him and believe in him and seek to serve him. What a great God we serve. And then there's almost this little commentary about, because this is the end of the historical part. Remember, beginning in chapter 7 through chapter 12 is all about visions and prophecies of future events. And verse 28 is just kind of a commentary for his life. So Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Those are the last two kings he served with. He enjoyed success. Now that may seem small to you, but how would you like it if somebody just said, and it was guaranteed to you, said, hey, listen, you just walk with God, you serve God, you trust God, and here's the guarantee that we'll give you. No matter who the king is, and he served under a lot of different kings, no matter who the king is, and no matter what the circumstances might be, and no matter whether they make right decisions or wrong decisions, here's the thing. If you'll just trust in God, here's the guarantee for you, you'll be successful. You'll be successful. And that's what it said about Daniel. And he was successful no matter who the king was. Because why? Because he trusted in his God. What a God we serve. What a God we serve. And I'm just glad he's in charge.